Hey everybody, it's Root Beer. There's no podcast episode this week for a variety of reasons, including but not limited to it's a slow news week and we couldn't come up with any topics. So in place of your regularly scheduled episode, we are instead going to have another installment of Random Vanguard History with Root Beer. Last time we talked about Dust and how it had to be errata'd pre-release. This time, we're going to be talking about the history of Ripples and Seven Seas and how they broke the game of Vanguard, because these archetypes just got supported in the recent V collection, and Odysseus is randomly expensive again. So let's start with Ripples, cause they came first. So Ripples were a ride chain originally introduced in BT11 no prefix. We are going all the way back to Boomer Vanguard here. So I wasn't around for this era of Vanguard, so I can't say definitively whether or not this card was any good in its time, but I feel like when discussing historical Aquaforce in this era, it gets overshadowed by like Maelstrom and Tetradrive, because Maelstrom is the OG boss monster, so of course a lot of people recognize it, and Tetradrive was very strong at this time. It got introduced a couple sets after this one. Genovius reads like a really powerful card because it can restand your board, but I can also see the Persona Blast being a huge limitation, keeping it from being viable. So while there may be some die-hard Ripple fans out there, I feel like overall they maybe didn't stand out all that much during their initial era. And then 2 years later, during the early days of G, they released an Aquaforce clan booster that supported a whole bunch of legacy archetypes, Ripples included. And this set is also when Ripples really become infamous in the community. So the clan booster included kind of your typical support, so there was a new grade 3 that acted as a revival legion for Genovius, as well as a new stride unit, and while those cards did see play, the card that had the biggest impact on Ripples was a grade 1 known as Flash Ripple Odysseus. So Odysseus reads, act rearguard circle once per turn, choose one of your other rearguards and put it in your soul. Search your deck for up to one card with Ripple in its card name with the same grade as your Vanguard, ride it as stand and shuffle your deck. If you road, choose up to one card not named Flash Ripple Odysseus from your soul, with the same grade as your Vanguard, call it to rearguard circle, and that unit gets power plus 2000 until end of turn. So, Odysseus was clearly designed to be a consistency card. As I stated before, the core Ripple cards were a ride chain, which means you wanted to be able to ride all of your chain in the correct order in order to gain extra benefits. In the case of Ripples, it was an extra 1000 power. So the intended design of Odysseus is to just fix your ride. It's meant to be 4 extra copies of whatever link in the chain you're missing. Now, if you weren't around for this era, then I'm sure you're wondering, what's so broken about this card? Being on the correct Vanguard is good and all, but how is this breaking the game in an era before gift markers were introduced? Well, you see, dear viewers, this was early G era. Strides were still the big shiny new mechanic, and Bushiroad really wanted you to play them. And so in order to facilitate that, they started printing restrictions on all of your rearguards called Generation Break. Generation Break, or GB, was a restriction where you couldn't activate an ability of your unit until you had a number of G units face up on the field or G zone equal to or greater than the GB number. If you're not striding in a GB-based deck, odds are you're just not doing anything. The thing is, though, both players have to be at grade 3 in order to stride. We didn't have the current premium rule where if you begin your turn at grade 3, you can just stride. Both players had to play ball here. If your opponent decides, you know what, I'm just not gonna ride up, well, congratulations, you've just been locked out of your G-zone. And that brings us back to Ripples. The grade 2 in the ride chain, Rising Ripple Pavroth, has an ability on Vanguard Circle that says, when this unit's attack hits a Vanguard, if you have a card named Silent Ripple Sorterio, the grade 1 in your soul, choose one of your Aquaforce rearguards, stand it, and that unit gets power plus 3000 until end of turn. So this is a pretty good skill, especially in an environment like G-era where the early game has gotten a lot slower. Pavroth can enable a lot of early aggression as long as you ride it consistently and maintain solid board presence. And hey, would you look at that? Odysseus does both of those things. So obviously Odysseus' skill ensures you have your proper ride chain, but also the bonus of being able to call something out means whatever previous grade 2 you were on is now just a body on the board, and the extra 2,000 from Odysseus' skill means you can hit 11k, which is just enough for a grade 3 Vanguard at the time. And if you called Unruly Ripple Lapis specifically, he is a 12k beater, so an extra 2,000 brings it to 14, add in a 7k booster, and you hit 21,000, which was the magic number at the time to get over a trigger. Throw in a couple of advantage cards like Tidal Rescue Sea Turtle Soldier and Light Signals Penguin Soldier, and you have a deck that can put up a lot of early aggression while maintaining card advantage, all at grade 2, so you lock your opponent out of being able to Stride or Legion, the most powerful mechanics of the time. And on top of all that, the deck still ran grade 3s that were decently powerful, so if you got to a point where you couldn't sustain the rush anymore, you could just ride up and either Legion or Stride and finish off your opponent that way. All in all, Ripples was just this annoyingly strong cheese deck that could pop off while locking you out of the game. It also won the World Championship Finals in 2015. I'm sure that was very fun for Bushiroad, having a game-breaking cheese deck be your world champion. They, of course, immediately hit this deck by limiting Odysseus to 2. They also released a Stride to counteract grade 2 stall named Air Elemental Sabreeze. So, Sabreeze was a card that, if you're at grade 3, you don't have any cards face up in your G-Zone, your opponent's Vanguard is grade 2, and they didn't ride during the ride phase of their previous turn, you could pay Counterblast 2 and discard a card from your hand to Stride it from face down. So Sabreeze is honestly kind of a terrible card, but because it was designed specifically to counteract the problem of grade stall, you had to run it just in case. Aside from dedicated stall decks like Ripples, sometimes your opponent might just strategically stay at grade 2 to try and take the first Stride, because it's so powerful. Sabreeze could be a punishment for that strategy, allowing you to take the first Stride and unlock GB before your opponent. But Counterblast 2 is a pretty heavy cost, and Sabreeze itself doesn't really do anything other than unlocking GB, so your turn might end up being really weak and you could have just wasted those resources. It's also incredibly easy to counter because your opponent could just ride another grade 2 during the ride phase if they were strategically stalling. So half the time it doesn't even do its intended job. And this card does nothing at all if your opponent were to say, stay at grade 1. Which brings us over to our other archetype for this video, 7 Seas. So this archetype was introduced in original BT13, and by archetype I mean exactly one card, the original Lord of the Seven Seas Night Mist. It was a completely generic break ride that just calls 2 things from drop, gives them 5k, and then they die at the end of turn. And then 2 years later, during the Winter 2015 Fighters Collection, they decided, you know what, this is an archetype now, and made a revival Stride for Night Mist. And subsequent main sets afterwards started introducing 7 Seas rearguards as well. At this point, we had already lived through the era of Ripples, and while it's not the greatest card ever, Sabreeze did do enough to check any sustained grade 2 stall decks. But that didn't stop people from trying to break the game anyways. Since grade 2 stall is kind of out of the question now with Sabreeze, they decided to go one lower and stall at grade 1 instead. I remember there was this old Doom post on the Vanguard subreddit warning about how grade 1 Rush was going to destroy Vanguard. The post wasn't very good, and it was mostly wrong. It used data from V-Mundi, which was this old Vanguard forum that was full of bad takes and everyone hated them. The post was really insistent that Liberator Rush was going to be the scourge of Vanguard, which did not happen. Now, I will give them some credit in that grade 1 Rush did eventually become a problem, just not in the way the post said that it would. So, as I was saying earlier, 7 Seas has been slowly accumulating support over the course of a few sets, and by GBT08, the archetype had enough cards to stand on its own, and because they were all legacy support, none of these new cards had GB restrictions on them. So naturally, this deck was just ripe for abuse. The core pieces of the strategy were 7 Seas Apprentice Night Runner, a grade 0 that, at the start of your main phase, if you have a 7 Seas Vanguard, you can mill the top 4 to call it from drop zone at rest and retire it at end of turn. 7 Seas Helmsman Night Crow, where if you have a 7 Seas Vanguard, you can retire something that isn't Night Crow to call it from drop zone. 7 Seas Pillager Night Spinal, who gained 2000 power every time a 7 Seas was called from the drop zone, and had a second effect that could call herself from the drop zone by discarding a 7 Seas name from your hand. And finally, 7 Seas Swordmaster Slash Shade, where when your 7 Seas Vanguard attacks, you can counterblast 1, retire a grade 1 or greater rearguard to call Slash Shade from drop zone and give it 2000 power. There was also Rice Tutor and Prisoner Dragon that saw play in the deck, though I wouldn't consider those two key combo pieces. Rice Tutor could mill the top card of your deck by resting himself, and then, if it's a 7 Seas card, you can call a different unit with the same grade, and it's retired at the end of turn. And Prisoner Dragon was a grade 3 version of Slash Shade, but it had to retire something that was grade 2 or greater. The basic gist of this deck is that you would have Night Runner in the drop zone, so you could mill 4 cards to call it and start setting up. Then you would have Night Spinal and Night Crow, who could convert your dead cards into proper bodies. Crow could clear out your dead rearguards like rested Night Runners, and Spinal could get rid of things like Slash Shade or other copies of herself. And while you're going through that board setup, the more 7 Seas names you call, the bigger Night Spinal gets. And then in the battle phase, you have Slash Shade and Prisoner Dragon, who can call themselves out to give you extra attacks. Throw in cards like Evil Shade and Performing Zombie that get you extra mills for consistency, and you have a really strong combo deck that gets upwards of 5 attacks, makes really big columns with Night Spinal, all while they're sat at grade 1, so if you're playing a GB-based deck, you just can't do anything. This deck was absolutely insane. I wasn't around for Ripple era, so I couldn't tell you how good that deck was in practice. But I was definitely around for this, and goddamn, 7 Seas was just unbearable during this time. If you don't know the matchup, then the first time you get locked out of your G-zone like this is just absolutely miserable. And if you did know the matchup, then you would know that the best way to deal with this deck was counterintuitively to harass its rearguards and try to grind out the game, which is an incredibly slow and tedious process that is also miserable to play. And then, later variants of the deck started adding 7 Seas Sage Plagueton, a grade 3 that could ride itself from the drop zone if you have a grade 2 or greater Vanguard, with 7 Seas in its name. So, depending on the variant your opponent is playing, you could end up in a situation where you're trying to slow down the game and grind your opponent out, and then suddenly they go up to grade 3 and stride. Oh, and also, this deck was incredibly cheap to build because all the cards were low rarity. So if you wanted a cheap-ass meta deck, just pull this sucker out and destroy your locals. This era of the game was easily one of the worst times in Vanguard's history. Even if we set aside 7 Seas, the top Stride decks at that time had long, oppressive combo turns that made a ridiculous number of attacks while also gaining a ton of card advantage. And then the best deck that could play against both the ridiculous Stride decks and 7 Runner was Sanctuary Guard Blaster, a deck that also had an annoying early rush. This was not a fun meta to be a part of. Especially if you were Bushiroad, because just like the previous year with Ripples, they got absolutely humiliated for a second time at Worlds, when the top 3 World Final decks were 7 Seas Rush, 7 Seas Rush but with Strides, and Sank Guard Blaster. Can you imagine being Bushiroad and having to crown a game-breaking cheese deck as your world champion for the second year in a row? So after all that, Bushiroad finally decided enough was enough, and they decided to limit Night Runner to 1, and you could no longer run it as your starting Vanguard, since it was kind of your main starter for getting things into the drop zone. And with that, 7 Seas was gone forever. I'm just kidding. They replaced the 3 missing copies of Runner with anything else, and the deck just kept going. So next they decided to put Nightcrow to 1 to stamp down on your board building ability. And that still didn't work because not too long afterwards they also limited Night Spinal. So after 3 consecutive hits to their consistency, 7 Seas Rush finally died. The rest of G-Era never really had any more problem decks like this. Other Grade 1 Rush decks just aren't that good, and after having to deal with 7 Seas, most people figured out the matchup. On top of that, Bushiroad finally started printing non-GB cards for GB-based decks, so more decks had options for early game. And that's about it. These days, grade stall isn't really anything you have to worry about. Sustained grade stall is kind of pointless when your opponent can just stride anyways, plus the prominence of V cards means that most decks wouldn't be locked out of the game anyways because nothing has GB anymore. It is funny to see that Nightcrow and Night Runner are still limited to 1 in Premium though. Like, I don't think they would impact the metagame all that much. It feels like they're just there out of spite at this point. Or maybe Bushiroad just forgot. As for the future of these archetypes, like I said in the beginning, they did get new support in the recent V collection. 7 Seas looks like it should become decently strong in V format. Not too sure about Premium though. And Ripples look like they're going to be absolutely busted with Odysseus in Premium. You can use Odysseus to keep rewriting Genovius and generate a bunch of extra Excel circles, as well as being able to use the new copy of Genovius' search skill. So you'll be able to generate a bunch of aggression and card advantage. So unless it's preemptively banned, look forward to that, I guess? But for now, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, please let me know in the comments. There's lots of really funny, interesting Vanguard history to cover. We got things like the Wise Men loop with Taro, Enigmatic Assassin. Hell, we could even just cover the ridiculous stride decks that were meta alongside 7 Seas. As always, you can find us on Twitter or Instagram at Nexus at Night. You can find me at Plasma Eclipse. You can find Atlas on Twitter or Instagram at Atlas Novak. You can find Matt at Wiggums, 2Gs, 2Zs. Thank you to our $10 patrons, Darren, Cole, Josh, Jeremy, and Mewwill. If you want to support our show, $5 gets you a whole ass bonus show, $10 gets you a shout out like I did just now, as well as early access to non-news/podcast videos. We have merch for sale, there will be a link in the description for that. And we also have a promo code at night for 5% off your order at 50cards.shop. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.